7 demons possessed her mind. Doctors declared her hopeless. Society called her cursed. But this broken woman would become history's most misunderstood figure, the first person to witness the impossible, the apostle to the apostles. From ultimate darkness to divine light, this is the true story of Mary Magdalene. Her name was Miriam, but history would know her as Mary from Magdala. In 15 AD, she was the most beautiful woman in Galilee. Dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence, a smile that could stop merchants mid-bargain in the bustling fish markets along the Sea of Galilee. At 22, she had everything: wealth from her family's successful perfume business, suitors lining up for marriage proposals, and respect throughout her hometown. You can picture her that last normal morning, standing on the rooftop of her family's limestone house, watching fishing boats return with their silver catch. The Mediterranean breeze carries the scent of jasmine from her mother's garden. Children play in the narrow streets below, calling her name with joy. Miriam! Miriam! Their innocent voices echo off ancient walls, not knowing this would be the final day they'd see her smile. The change began as a whisper in her mind during evening prayers, a voice that wasn't her own, speaking words she'd never think. "You don't belong here," it hissed during the recitation of the Shema. She shook her head, attributing it to fatigue from the day's work grinding cinnamon and frankincense in her father's perfumery. But that night, sleep brought no peace. Dreams twisted into nightmares, where faceless figures pursued her through dark corridors that had no end. She woke screaming at dawn, her sleeping clothes soaked in sweat, her mother rushing in with wide, terrified eyes. "Daughter, what troubles you?" Rachel asked, placing cool hands on Miriam's burning forehead. I don't know, Mother. The dreams were so real. There were voices, faces I couldn't see but somehow recognized. The next morning brought the first seizure. Miriam collapsed while measuring precious spikenard oil, her body convulsing violently, foam at her mouth, eyes rolled back showing only white. When consciousness returned 20 minutes later, she spoke in a voice her family had never heard, deeper, harsher, filled with knowledge of secrets she couldn't possibly know. "Your husband still visits Rebecca the widow every Sabbath afternoon," the voice said through Miriam's lips, addressing her mother with cruel accuracy. Rachel gasped, recognizing the truth of an affair she'd suspected, but never confirmed. Word spread through Magdala like wildfire. The beautiful perfume merchant's daughter had been touched by darkness. Customers who once lingered to hear her melodic voice now hurried past their shop. Friends who had shared gossip and laughter now crossed streets to avoid her. Dr. Marcus Tiberius, the most respected physician in the region, traveled from Capernaum to examine her. His leather bag contained instruments that had healed Roman officials and wealthy merchants, remedies that had built his reputation throughout Galilee. He spent hours studying Miriam during her episodes, taking detailed notes on papyrus scrolls. "I've seen battlefield injuries that made hardened soldiers weep," he confided to her father after the examination. "I've treated plague victims whose suffering defied description. But this is beyond my knowledge." The girl displays symptoms of 7 distinct personalities, each with different voices, mannerisms, and knowledge bases. Yesterday, she spoke fluent Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and what sounded like ancient Egyptian, languages she's never studied. Her father's savings, accumulated over decades of perfume trading, vanished into the purses of healers, exorcists, and traveling miracle workers. Each promised a cure, each demanded payment up front, each ultimately failed. The traditional rabbinical approach of prayer and fasting proved useless. Greek physicians, with their balance of humors theories, prescribed bloodletting that only weakened her further. Egyptian mystics attempted elaborate rituals involving sacred geometry and star alignments. The demons, for everyone now agreed, that's what inhabited her. seemed to mock each attempted cure. During one exorcism attempt, they spoke through Miriam in perfect unison. "You cannot cast out what owns what it inhabits. She belongs to us now, and we are legion." Months stretched into 2 unbearable years. The beautiful woman who once turned heads now couldn't leave her house without causing chaos. Children threw stones, women whispered about divine punishment for hidden sins, and former friends acted as if she'd died. Her engagement to David, a successful wine merchant, dissolved when his family declared her cursed by association with demons. The physical transformation was devastating. Constant seizures had left her thin. Her once lustrous hair now tangled and often torn out during episodes. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from sleepless nights filled with demonic torment. Scars covered her arms where she'd injured herself during convulsions, unable to control her own body. But the psychological torment was worse than physical suffering. Imagine having your mind invaded by 7 distinct evil personalities, each with its own agenda, each competing for control of your thoughts and actions. One demon specialized in blasphemy, turning every prayer into obscenity. Another focused on violence, making her lash out at family members who tried to help. A third demon of lust filled her mind with sexual images that horrified her pure spirit. "Please," she begged during rare moments of lucidity, tears streaming down her gaunt cheeks. "Please, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, if you exist, if you care, free me from this torment. I cannot endure much longer." Her mother found her one morning, unconscious on the floor beside an empty bottle of hemlock. The demons had tried to force her to commit suicide, but somehow, perhaps divine intervention, she'd survived the poison that should have killed her within hours. That near-death experience marked a turning point, though no one realized it yet. Word had begun spreading throughout Galilee about a young rabbi from Nazareth who cast out demons with unprecedented authority. His name was Jesus, and unlike the ineffective exorcists who'd failed Miriam, this teacher commanded evil spirits with simple words, and they obeyed instantly. For the first time in 2 years, a spark of hope flickered in the darkness that had consumed Mary Magdalene's life. By 17 AD, Mary's condition had deteriorated beyond recognition. The woman who once managed complex business transactions in 4 languages now couldn't dress herself without assistance. The demons had divided her personality into fractured pieces, each fighting for dominance like wild animals in a cage too small to contain them. Dr. Flavius Josephus, Rome's most expensive physician, arrived from Caesarea Maritima with an entourage of assistants and a reputation for healing impossible cases. His fee alone, 50 silver denarii, represented 6 months of wages for a common laborer. Mary's father liquidated his remaining perfume inventory to afford this final chance. "I've treated senators, governors, even members of Caesar's family," Josephus announced, unpacking instruments that gleamed like precious metals. "Mental afflictions are my specialty. Your daughter's condition, while severe, is not beyond Roman medical science." He prescribed a regimen that seemed logical: precise dietary restrictions, daily exercises, herbal compounds mixed according to secret formulas, and bloodletting scheduled to coincide with moon phases. For 3 months, the family followed his instructions religiously, documenting every detail as he'd demanded. The results were catastrophic. Mary's seizures increased in frequency and violence. Where she'd once experienced episodes twice weekly, they now occurred daily, sometimes multiple times per day. The demons seemed energized by the medical interventions, mocking the doctor through Mary's voice in fluent Latin, using medical terminology she'd never learned. "Your treatments feed us, Roman fool," they sneered during one particularly violent episode. "Each bloodletting weakens her resistance. Each herb you prescribe opens new doorways for our kind. Continue your healing. We welcome it." Dr. Josephus packed his instruments and departed in the middle of the night, refusing to accept payment and warning Mary's family never to speak of his failure. The last hope of conventional medicine had crumbled. Desperate beyond reason, her parents turned to the supernatural marketplace that thrived in first-century Palestine. Every village harbored exorcists, mystics, and religious specialists, claiming power over demonic forces. Some were sincere, but powerless. Others were charlatans exploiting desperate families. All demanded payment up front. Eli the Babylonian arrived with ancient scrolls covered in symbols that predated Hebrew scripture. He claimed descent from the Magi who'd interpreted dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, promising that Mesopotamian magic could bind any evil spirit. His ritual involved burning expensive incense, chanting in unknown tongues, and drawing geometric patterns around Mary's bed with blessed oils. For 7 days and nights, Eli maintained his vigil, speaking incantations that seemed to cause physical pain to Mary's demonic inhabitants. They shrieked and writhed, but ultimately remained. On the 8th morning, exhausted and defeated, Eli gathered his scrolls and departed, mumbling about powers beyond ancient knowledge. Marcus the Egyptian claimed initiation into mysteries older than the pyramids. His approach involved complex astrology calculations, determining that Mary's demons had entered during an eclipse when malevolent planets aligned. His solution required waiting 18 months for a proper cosmic configuration, then performing rituals involving sacred geometry and specialized crystals imported from Nubia. The astronomical timing never arrived. Marcus kept extending the waiting period, demanding additional payments for more precise calculations, until Mary's father realized the scam and banished him from their home. Rabbi Solomon from Jerusalem represented traditional Jewish exorcism methods. A scholarly man with genuine spiritual depth, he approached Mary's condition through prayer, fasting, and scriptural recitation. Unlike the pagan mystics, he charged no fee, accepting only basic hospitality while he attempted to help. For 2 weeks, Solomon fasted dawn to dusk while reciting psalms over Mary's tormented form. His sincerity was unquestionable, his knowledge of Torah impressive, his dedication absolute. Yet, the demons merely laughed at his efforts, quoting scripture back to him with twisted interpretations that turned holy words into blasphemy. "We know the Holy One of Israel," they mocked. "We were present when he formed Adam from dust, when he walked with Enoch, when he spoke to Moses from the burning bush. Your prayers are whispers. We have heard the voice of the Almighty himself. What power do you think you possess that we should fear?" Solomon left in tears, admitting defeat, but promising to remember Mary in his prayers. His failure crushed the family's remaining hope in religious solutions. The physical toll on Mary was becoming unbearable. Constant seizures had caused multiple injuries, broken ribs from violent convulsions, deep cuts from falling against sharp objects, burned hands from approaching fire during episodes she couldn't remember. Her weight had dropped to dangerous levels as the demons often prevented her from eating, claiming they preferred their vessel empty. Worse than physical suffering was the social death that accompanied demonic possession. Magdala's residents now viewed Mary as a walking curse, dangerous to be near, contaminating everything she touched. Children ran when they saw her approaching. Merchants closed their shops if she entered. Even beggars avoided sharing space with someone clearly abandoned by God. The family's once prosperous perfume business collapsed entirely. No one would purchase products from a household harboring demons. Customers feared contamination. Employees quit to avoid association with evil spirits, and suppliers refused deliveries to a cursed address. Mary's father aged a decade in 2 years. His hair turned completely gray, deep lines creased his face, and the confident voice that once negotiated profitable contracts now shook when he spoke his daughter's name. Her mother Rachel stopped eating regularly, convinced that her daughter's condition was divine punishment for some unknown sin she'd committed. "Perhaps we should take her far from here." Rachel whispered one sleepless night. "Find a place where no one knows our story, where she might have peace in her final days." But even in isolated locations, Mary's condition drew unwanted attention. The demons seemed to enjoy public spectacles, causing violent episodes in crowded marketplaces where maximum numbers of people could witness their power. During one particularly horrible incident in Capernaum's fish market, the demons threw Mary's body to the ground and spoke simultaneously through her voice, addressing random strangers by name and revealing secrets that caused 3 marriages to dissolve on the spot, and 2 merchants to flee town in shame. The crowd that gathered was equal parts horrified and fascinated, treating Mary's torment as entertainment. That night, alone in a rented room above a bakery, Mary experienced a moment of clarity that would prove prophetic. Through the haze of demonic control, she heard distant voices discussing someone called the Nazarene, who'd recently amazed crowds by commanding demons with unprecedented authority. Unlike other exorcists, this Jesus simply speaks, and evil spirits flee, whispered a baker's wife to her neighbor. He doesn't require payment, rituals, or even lengthy prayers, just a word from his mouth, and demons that have tormented people for years disappear instantly. For the first time in months, Mary felt something besides despair. Could this carpenter's son from Nazareth really possess power that had eluded doctors, mystics, and religious professionals? Her parents, having exhausted every conventional option, decided to seek this Jesus of Nazareth. It was their last hope and Mary's only remaining chance at freedom from the darkness that had consumed her life. The journey to find Jesus required 3 days of traveling through Galilean hill country, and every mile presented new challenges for Mary's tormented condition. The demons seemed to sense approaching danger, increasing their attacks with desperate fury. During the first night, camped beside the Jordan River, Mary's screaming episodes were so violent that other travelers packed their belongings and moved to distant campsites, fearful of whatever evil inhabited the young woman. "She's getting worse the closer we come to him," her mother Rachel observed with growing concern. "What if this Jesus cannot help her either? What if we've brought her all this way only to face another disappointment?" Her father, Joachim, had aged visibly during their journey, the strain of restraining Mary during public episodes taking its physical toll. "Then we'll know we tried everything humanly possible," he replied, though his voice carried more hope than his words suggested. They found Jesus teaching beside the Sea of Galilee, surrounded by several hundred people who'd gathered to hear the young rabbi speak about God's kingdom. Mary's parents recognized him immediately. Unlike other religious teachers who dressed in elaborate robes and surrounded themselves with impressive entourages, this Jesus wore simple carpenter's clothes and sat on the ground like a common laborer. But there was something different about his presence, an authority that seemed to radiate from his very being. When he spoke about forgiveness, healing, and divine love, even the most skeptical listeners found themselves hanging on every word. Children who usually fidgeted during religious instruction sat perfectly still, mesmerized by parables about seeds, sheep, and loving fathers. Mary's demons, however, reacted with immediate hostility to Jesus' proximity. From a distance of nearly 100 yards, they began shrieking through her voice with such intensity that the entire crowd turned to stare. But instead of the usual fear and disgust that Mary's condition provoked, several people looked at her with expressions of deep compassion. "Look," whispered an elderly woman to her companion, "another soul imprisoned by darkness. Perhaps the Master will free her as he did blind Bartimaeus and lame Matthias." Jesus paused his teaching mid-sentence, his eyes searching the crowd until they found Mary's tortured form. The moment their gazes met, the demons controlling her began screaming in languages that predated human civilization, ancient tongues that hurt the ears of those who heard them. "We know who you are, Holy One of God," the demons shrieked in unison. Have you come to destroy us before the appointed time? We are legion, for we are many. You have no authority over us in this place." But Jesus stood slowly, his expression combining divine authority with human tenderness. The crowd parted automatically, creating a path between the master and the tormented woman. Each step he took toward Mary caused the demons to increase their frantic protests, but their panic betrayed their powerlessness against his approaching presence. "You cannot come closer," they screamed through Mary's lips. "We have inhabited this vessel for years. We own her mind, her body, her very soul. She belongs to darkness now." Jesus stopped directly in front of Mary, close enough that she could see the compassion in his eyes, despite the demonic terror that controlled her reactions. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, perfect love faced absolute evil in a confrontation that would determine one woman's eternal destiny. "Daughter," Jesus said softly, speaking past the demons directly to Mary's imprisoned spirit, "you have suffered long enough." Those simple words penetrated the darkness that had surrounded Mary's consciousness for 2 years. For just an instant, she glimpsed light, not the harsh brightness that hurt her eyes during seizures, but warm, gentle illumination that promised safety and healing. In that moment, she understood that this Jesus truly was who the demons claimed, the Holy One of God. Then Jesus turned his attention to Mary's tormentors with an authority that made the air itself seem to vibrate with divine power. His voice, though not raised above normal speaking volume, carried across the entire gathering and seemed to echo from the very throne of heaven. "You deaf and mute spirits," he commanded with absolute finality, "I charge you, come out of her and never enter her again." The demon's response was immediate and violent. Mary's body convulsed as if struck by lightning, her back arching impossibly as 7 distinct voices screamed in harmony, a sound so terrible that many witnesses would remember it for the rest of their lives. But even as they shrieked their defiance, the evil spirits were being torn from their stronghold in Mary's mind. "No, no, this vessel is ours by right. We entered when she was vulnerable. We built fortresses in her thoughts. Their protests were cut short as divine power expelled them like a hurricane clearing debris. Mary felt each demon being ripped from different areas of her consciousness, the blasphemous spirit that had corrupted her prayers, the violent entity that made her strike loved ones, the lustful presence that filled her mind with shameful images, the despairing demon that whispered suicide suggestions, the prideful spirit that rejected all help, the fearful entity that made her cower in terror, and finally, the controlling master demon that had coordinated the others' attacks. As the 7th and final evil spirit left her body, Mary collapsed to the ground, not in seizure this time, but in exhausted relief. For the first time in 2 years, her mind was completely, perfectly her own. The constant mental noise that had driven her nearly insane was replaced by blessed silence. When she opened her eyes 30 seconds later, the first thing she saw was Jesus kneeling beside her, one hand gently touching her forehead. The demons were gone, not hidden, not suppressed, but completely expelled from every corner of her being. She could think clearly, speak normally, and most miraculously of all, she felt clean. "Master," she whispered, her voice hoarse from years of demonic screaming, but unmistakably her own. "You have given me back my life." Jesus smiled, the expression of someone who'd watched his daughter return from the dead. "Your faith has made you whole, Mary. Go in peace." But as she struggled to sit up, supported by her weeping parents, Mary realized that she couldn't simply go in peace, as if nothing had happened. This Jesus had accomplished what the most expensive doctors, most powerful mystics, and most learned rabbis had declared impossible. He had restored not just her mental health, but her very identity as a human being created in God's image. "Master," she said, grasping the hem of his robe with trembling hands. "Let me follow you. I owe you a debt I can never repay. These demons stole 2 years of my life, but you have given me eternity." Jesus looked down at her with the same compassion he'd shown before her healing, understanding that Mary's request came not from obligation, but from a heart transformed by divine love. "Then come," he said simply, helping her to her feet. "There are others who need to hear about God's power to heal the broken and free the captive." As Mary stood upright for the first time in months, without fear of falling, without mental voices screaming contradictory commands, without the crushing weight of demonic oppression, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope. Not just hope for herself, but hope that this Jesus could transform other lives just as dramatically as he'd transformed hers. She was no longer Mary Magdalene, the demon-possessed woman who frightened children and closed businesses. She was Mary Magdalene, follower of Jesus Christ, witness to the power that could overcome any darkness. The transformation was immediate and total. Within hours of her deliverance, Mary's physical appearance began changing as dramatically as her spiritual condition. The dark circles that had shadowed her eyes for 2 years faded by sunset. Her tangled, often self-mutilated hair seemed to regain its natural luster overnight. Most remarkably, the scars covering her arms from demonic episodes started healing at an accelerated rate that amazed even her parents. "It's as if the demons took her youth with them when they left," her mother Rachel marveled, watching Mary eat her first full meal in months without interruption from seizures or violent outbursts. "Look at her face, Joachim. She looks younger now than before the possession began." But the psychological healing was even more dramatic than physical restoration. For the first time in years, Mary could pray without blasphemous thoughts invading her mind. She could interact with strangers without fearing what the demons might make her say or do. Most precious of all, she could sleep peacefully through entire nights, no longer tormented by the horrific nightmares that had made rest impossible. Jesus had continued his journey around the Sea of Galilee, but Mary and her parents followed at a respectful distance, unwilling to let their daughter stray far from the man who'd saved her life. They weren't alone. A growing crowd of followers traveled with the young rabbi, including several women who'd also experienced miraculous healing. Among them was Joanna, wife of Chusa, who managed King Herod's household. She'd been healed of a chronic illness that had left her bedridden for 5 years. Susanna, a wealthy widow from Magdala, had been cured of a blood disorder that made her ritually unclean for over a decade. These women, along with Mary, began providing financial support for Jesus' ministry from their own resources. "It feels right to use my father's perfume business profits to support the Master's work," Mary explained as she purchased food and supplies for the traveling group. "Money that once seemed so important now has value only when used to serve God's kingdom." The change in Mary's relationship with material wealth reflected her complete spiritual transformation. Before her possession, she'd taken pride in expensive clothing, elaborate jewelry, and the social status that came with her family's business success. Now she found joy in the simple white tunic and blue outer garment that marked her as one of Jesus' dedicated followers. More significantly, Mary discovered she possessed spiritual gifts that had been suppressed during her years of demonic oppression. She could sense when people were struggling with depression, addiction, or spiritual confusion, not through supernatural revelation, but through heightened empathy that seemed to be a side effect of her own healing experience. "Master," she asked Jesus one evening as they camped near Bethsaida, "why can I perceive others' pain so clearly now? Sometimes I look at people in the crowds and immediately understand their deepest struggles, even when they're trying to hide them." Jesus smiled with the expression of a teacher whose student had discovered an important truth. "Those who have been forgiven much, love much," he replied. "Your years of suffering weren't wasted, Mary. They've given you compassion for others who feel hopeless, and authority to speak to those imprisoned by darkness. This insight proved prophetic. As Jesus' ministry expanded throughout Galilee and Judea, Mary became particularly effective at ministering to women struggling with mental illness, demonic oppression, and social rejection. Her testimony carried unique power because she could honestly say, "I understand your pain because I've experienced worse, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that no condition is beyond Jesus' power to heal." In Capernaum, she spent hours with Rachel, a young mother who'd been exhibiting symptoms similar to Mary's former condition, hearing voices, experiencing personality changes, frightening her children with behaviors she couldn't control. Traditional healers had declared her case hopeless, but Mary's persistent encouragement gave Rachel courage to approach Jesus for healing. "2 years ago, I was exactly where you are now," Mary told Rachel as they waited for Jesus to finish teaching. "7 demons controlled my thoughts, my words, my actions. I lost my friends, my reputation, my hope for any normal future. But look at me now, completely free, completely whole, completely at peace. If Jesus could heal me, he can certainly heal you." When Jesus commanded the demons to leave Rachel, Mary was the first person to embrace the newly freed woman, understanding perfectly the mixture of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming joy that comes with sudden liberation from mental torment. Similar scenes played out across Palestine as Mary became an unofficial specialist in pre- and post-deliverance counseling. She knew how to prepare people for the possibility of healing, how to support them during the sometimes violent process of deliverance, and how to help them adjust to normal life after years of mental illness. Her parents initially worried that following Jesus represented another form of instability, but they soon recognized that Mary had found her true calling. "She's more herself now than she ever was before the possession," Joachim confided to Rachel. "It's as if God used those terrible years to prepare her for something important." That something important began manifesting as Mary's role in Jesus' ministry expanded beyond personal testimony. She possessed an intuitive understanding of Scripture that amazed even the male disciples who'd received traditional rabbinical training. During evening discussions about Jesus' parables, Mary often provided insights that illuminated deeper meanings the others had missed. The Master's teaching about seeds falling on different types of soil, she explained to Peter and John after one particularly complex lesson, relates directly to why some people accept healing immediately, while others remain bound despite encountering the same divine power. The condition of their hearts determines how deeply God's truth can take root. Her business background proved equally valuable to the ministry's practical needs. While the disciples often approached financial planning with the improvident faith of fishermen who'd never managed budgets, Mary applied her commercial experience to ensure adequate supplies for the traveling group and wise stewardship of donated funds. Most importantly, Mary's presence added a dimension of respectability to Jesus' ministry that helped counter critics who questioned the propriety of unmarried men traveling with single women. Her obvious spiritual maturity, moral character, and deep theological understanding made it impossible for opponents to credibly suggest inappropriate relationships within Jesus' inner circle. As months passed, Mary's transformation became one of the most powerful testimonies supporting Jesus' claims to divine authority. People who remembered her demonic possession would encounter her months later and barely recognize the poised, articulate, spiritually radiant woman she'd become. "That's impossible," whispered one Magdala resident who met Mary in Jerusalem. "Miriam, the perfume merchant's daughter, has been possessed by demons for years. She's violent, incoherent, barely human anymore." "I am Mary of Magdala," she replied gently, "and I was indeed possessed by 7 demons. But Jesus of Nazareth commanded them to leave, and they obeyed. Now I serve him who gave me back my life." Such encounters multiplied Mary's evangelistic impact far beyond her personal efforts. Every person who witnessed her transformation became a walking advertisement for Jesus' power to heal the impossible and restore the irredeemable. By the second year of her freedom, Mary had evolved from grateful follower to trusted disciple, from testimony bearer to ministry leader, from rescued victim to powerful witness. She was preparing, though she didn't yet know it, for the most important role any human being would ever play in the early Christian church. 3 years after her deliverance, Mary faced the darkest day in human history. The man who'd given her back her sanity, her dignity, and her purpose was hanging naked and bleeding on a Roman cross outside Jerusalem's walls, dying the death of a condemned criminal while crowds mocked his claims to be the Son of God. The journey to this moment had been building for weeks. Jesus' ministry had increasingly antagonized the religious establishment, particularly after he cleansed the temple and publicly condemned the corruption of Jewish leaders. Mary had watched with growing concern as her master's teachings became more direct, his warnings more urgent, his references to his coming death more frequent. "He's been preparing us for something terrible," she confided to Joanna as they traveled toward Jerusalem for Passover. "Yesterday, he spoke again about being betrayed, about suffering many things from the elders and chief priests. I've seen him heal the blind, raise the dead, command storms. Surely no human authority can harm him." But Mary's years of demonic oppression had taught her to recognize spiritual warfare, and she could sense dark forces gathering around Jesus like storm clouds before a hurricane. The same supernatural malice that had once controlled her mind was now orchestrating events to destroy the man who'd liberated her. The betrayal came from within their own group. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 closest disciples, led temple guards to arrest Jesus in Gethsemane garden. Mary watched in horror as soldiers bound the hands that had healed her, struck the face that had shown her compassion, and dragged away the voice that had commanded demons to release their grip on her life. While the male disciples scattered in terror, even bold Peter denying he'd ever known Jesus, Mary and the other women followed the arresting party back to the city. They maintained a careful distance, but refused to abandon their master during his hour of greatest need. The trials were a mockery of justice that lasted all night and into the morning. Religious leaders who claimed to serve God condemned the Son of God based on false testimony and trumped-up charges. Roman authorities who prided themselves on legal precision bowed to political pressure rather than protect an innocent man. Mary stood in the crowd as Pontius Pilate presented Jesus to the people, his back shredded by Roman scourging, his face swollen beyond recognition from the beating administered by temple guards. The man who'd spoken words of life to thousands could barely stand upright as blood dripped from the crown of thorns pressed into his scalp. "Behold your king," Pilate announced sarcastically, perhaps hoping the sight of Jesus' suffering would satisfy the bloodthirsty crowd. Instead, the mob screamed louder, "Crucify him! Crucify him! We have no king but Caesar." Mary felt something die inside her heart as she watched people who'd begged Jesus for healing, now demanding his execution. Some of these same voices had shouted, "Hosanna," just days earlier when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. The fickleness of human nature, the ease with which crowds could be manipulated toward evil, reminded her of her own helplessness during demonic possession. When Pilate ceremonially washed his hands and delivered Jesus to be crucified, Mary knew she would witness her Savior's death. But unlike the male disciples who'd fled to protect themselves, she was determined to remain with Jesus until the end, no matter the personal cost. The procession to Golgotha moved slowly through Jerusalem's narrow streets. Jesus, weakened by blood loss and exhaustion, stumbled repeatedly under the weight of his cross. Roman soldiers eventually forced a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the wooden beam, while Jesus staggered behind, surrounded by weeping women who mourned for the teacher who'd brought such hope to Israel. Mary walked with this group of women, her heart breaking with each labored step Jesus took toward his execution. This was the man who'd commanded 7 demons with a single word, now barely able to put one foot in front of the other. This was the voice that had taught with divine authority, now gasping for breath in the dust of a Roman road. At Golgotha, the place of the skull, Mary watched Roman soldiers strip Jesus naked and nail his hands and feet to the cross with iron spikes. Each hammer blow echoed like thunder in her mind, driving home the reality that her master was being murdered by the very people he'd come to save. As they raised the cross upright, Jesus looked down at the small group of women who'd remained faithful when all others had fled. His eyes found Mary's face among the crowd, and despite his agony, she saw recognition and love in his gaze. "Woman, behold your son," he said to his mother, indicating John, who'd finally returned. "Son, behold your mother." But Mary understood that Jesus was also entrusting all his female followers to the care of the male disciples, ensuring they wouldn't be abandoned after his death. For 6 hours, Mary stood beneath the cross, watching her Savior die by degrees. She heard him pray for his executioners. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." She witnessed his promise to the repentant thief. "Today you will be with me in paradise." She watched him endure the mockers who challenged him to save himself, if he truly was the Son of God. But it was Jesus' final words that revealed the true meaning of his death to Mary's understanding, when he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" She recognized the spiritual reality behind his physical suffering. Jesus was experiencing the separation from God that sin creates, not his own sin, for he had none, but the collective sin of humanity that he was bearing on their behalf. In that moment, Mary understood that Jesus was experiencing something like her own demonic possession in reverse. Instead of evil spirits entering him to cause torment, he was taking into himself the spiritual darkness that belonged to everyone else, including her. The man who'd freed her from demons was allowing himself to be imprisoned by the sin that had made demonic possession possible. When Jesus finally cried, "It is finished," and breathed his last, Mary felt the earth shake beneath her feet and watched the sky grow unnaturally dark. Even nature seemed to mourn the death of its creator. As Roman soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear to confirm his death, Mary made a decision that would prove crucial to Christianity's future. While others discussed burial arrangements or mourned the apparent end of their hopes, she determined to be present for whatever happened next. Her years of torment had taught her that death isn't always final, that supernatural power can reverse what seems irreversible, that God specializes in bringing life from lifelessness. If anyone could overcome death itself, it would be the man who'd overcome the demons that had held her captive. Mary Magdalene would be the first person to discover that her faith was justified. Sunday morning, 3 days after the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene rose before dawn with a heart heavy with grief, but driven by love that demanded action, while other disciples remained in hiding, paralyzed by fear and confusion. She couldn't bear the thought of Jesus' body lying unattended in Joseph of Arimathea's borrowed tomb. The crucifixion had been rushed due to approaching Sabbath, leaving no time for proper burial preparation. Jewish burial customs required washing the body with aromatic spices, wrapping it in linen cloths, and anointing it with expensive perfumes, rituals that honored the deceased and provided closure for mourning families. Mary had purchased a substantial quantity of myrrh and aloes the evening before, spending nearly her entire remaining savings on the finest burial spices available in Jerusalem's markets. Other women, Mary, the mother of James, Salome, and several others, had gathered similar materials, all determined to provide their master with the honorable burial he deserved. "We should go while it's still early," Mary suggested, as the first hints of dawn appeared over Jerusalem's eastern walls. "Roman guards will be changing shift, and we'll have better privacy to complete our work." The women faced a practical problem they hadn't fully considered. The massive stone ceiling Jesus' tomb weighed several hundred pounds, far beyond their ability to move. But their love for Jesus outweighed practical concerns. They would find some way to access his body, even if it meant bribing guards or recruiting male help. As they walked through Jerusalem's empty streets carrying their burial spices, Mary reflected on the spiritual journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years earlier, she'd been a demon-possessed woman whom everyone avoided. Now she was leading a group of women to honor a crucified teacher, risking arrest or worse to provide proper burial rites for the man who'd changed her life. The walk to Joseph's garden tomb took nearly an hour, giving Mary time to process the events of the previous 3 days. She still couldn't fully comprehend how the religious leaders had succeeded in killing Jesus. The man who'd commanded storms, fed thousands with a boy's lunch, and raised Lazarus from the dead had submitted to arrest, trials, and execution without using his supernatural power to escape. Perhaps he chose to die? She mused to herself as they approached the tomb. Perhaps his death serves some purpose we don't yet understand. But as they crested the small hill overlooking Joseph's garden, Mary stopped short, her burial spices falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. The massive stone that had sealed Jesus' tomb had been rolled away, leaving the entrance gaping open like a mouth frozen in surprise. "The stone," gasped Salome. "Who moved the stone?" Mary's first thought was grave robbers. In a culture where tombs often contained valuable burial goods, criminal gangs sometimes targeted recent burials, especially those of wealthy individuals. But what thieves would risk stealing the body of an executed criminal that Roman guards were supposedly protecting? Approaching the tomb cautiously, Mary peered into the dark interior and saw something that made her gasp in shock. The linen burial cloths that had wrapped Jesus' body lay collapsed and empty, like a cocoon after a butterfly's emergence. The face cloth that had covered his head was folded separately, placed precisely where his head would have rested. "His body is gone," Mary whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the empty tomb. "Someone has taken our Lord's body, and we don't know where they've laid him." Her first instinct was to alert the male disciples. Despite their cowardice during the crucifixion, they needed to know that Jesus' body had been disturbed. Mary ran through Jerusalem's streets, her heart pounding with a mixture of grief and indignation that someone had violated her master's resting place. She found Peter and John still barricaded in the upper room, where they'd shared the Last Supper, fearful of arrest by the same authorities who'd killed Jesus. When Mary burst through the door gasping, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have laid him," both men reacted with immediate alarm. Peter and John raced back to the tomb, with Mary following behind despite her exhaustion. The younger John arrived first, stooping to peer into the sepulchre, but not entering. When Peter arrived moments later, he charged directly inside, examining the burial cloths with the methodical attention of a fisherman inspecting nets. "The cloths are undisturbed," Peter observed, his voice puzzled. "If grave robbers took the body, they would have torn away these expensive linens. But look, the wrappings lie exactly as they would if the body simply vanished from within them." John entered the tomb and saw the same evidence that had mystified Peter. Neither man could explain what they had witnessed, but both recognized that normal grave robbery didn't account for the precise arrangement of burial cloths. Whatever had happened here was beyond their experience or understanding. The disciples returned to their hiding place, leaving Mary alone at the tomb with her grief and confusion. She couldn't simply walk away from the place where Jesus had been buried, even if his body was no longer there. Sitting outside the tomb's entrance, she wept with the abandoned sorrow of someone who'd lost everything that gave her life meaning. Through her tears, she noticed movement inside the tomb and bent down for another look. What she saw made her breath catch. 2 men in brilliant white clothing sitting where Jesus' body should have been, one at the head position and one at the feet. "Woman, why are you weeping?" one of them asked gently. "Because they have taken away my Lord," Mary replied through her tears, "and I don't know where they have laid him." As she spoke, she became aware of someone standing behind her. Assuming it was the garden caretaker, she turned without really looking at his face, too overcome with grief to pay attention to appearances. "Woman, why are you weeping?" the figure asked. "Who are you seeking?" "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away," Mary pleaded, prepared to carry Jesus' body on her own shoulders if necessary to ensure proper burial. Then the figure spoke her name, Mary. No one had ever spoken her name with quite that tone. Infinite tenderness, complete understanding, perfect love. It was the same voice that had commanded 7 demons to leave her body, the same voice that had taught crowds about God's kingdom, the same voice that had cried, "It is finished," from the cross 3 days earlier. "Rabboni," she cried, using the Hebrew term that meant "my master," but carried implications of deep personal relationship. She moved to embrace him, to touch him, to confirm that he was real, and not a grief-induced hallucination. "Do not cling to me," Jesus said gently, "for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." In that moment, Mary understood that she was witnessing the impossible. Jesus of Nazareth had risen from the dead. Not resuscitation like Lazarus, who would die again, but resurrection into a new kind of life that death could never again touch. She was also receiving the most important commission in human history, to be the first evangelist of the resurrection, the first person to proclaim that death had been defeated, sin had been conquered, and hope was available to everyone who believed. Mary Magdalene, once possessed by 7 demons, was now chosen to be the apostle to the apostles. Mary ran from the garden tomb with news that would change human history forever. But when she burst into the upper room where the disciples were hiding, her announcement was met with skepticism that bordered on disbelief. "I have seen the Lord," she declared breathlessly. "He is risen. Jesus spoke to me, gave me a message for all of you." The male disciples, still traumatized by their master's crucifixion and their own cowardice in abandoning him, struggled to process Mary's extraordinary claim. In first-century Jewish culture, women's testimony wasn't considered legally valid in court proceedings. The idea that God would choose a woman, especially a former demoniac, to be the first witness of humanity's most important event seemed inconceivable to men trained in traditional rabbinical thinking. "She's overcome with grief," Thomas muttered. "People sometimes have visions when they're mourning someone they loved." "The tomb was empty," Peter confirmed. "We saw that ourselves. But resurrection? That's impossible. We watched him die, saw the spear pierce his side, helped take his body down from the cross." But Mary persisted with the detailed accuracy of someone reporting absolute truth. She described Jesus' appearance, the sound of his voice, his specific instructions about ascending to the Father. Most convincingly, she recounted conversations and personal details that no hallucination could have produced. "He told me to tell you that he is ascending to my Father and your Father, my God and your God," Mary repeated. Those were his exact words. He's claiming you as his brothers, establishing a family relationship between you and God the Father. Despite their initial skepticism, several disciples began reconsidering Mary's testimony. She'd never been prone to fantasies or delusions, even during her years of demonic possession. Her mental clarity since her healing had been remarkable, her spiritual insights consistently accurate. More importantly, her transformation from demon-possessed outcast to trusted ministry partner had established her credibility on supernatural matters. If anyone could recognize the difference between spiritual reality and imagination, it would be someone who'd experienced both demonic deception and divine deliverance. As the day progressed, other women returned from the tomb with similar reports. Mary, the mother of James, Salome, and Joanna, had encountered angels who confirmed that Jesus had risen from the dead. Their testimonies corroborated Mary Magdalene's account in specific details that couldn't be coincidental. By evening, when Jesus himself appeared to the disciples in the locked room, Mary's role as the first resurrection witness was vindicated. But her importance to early Christianity extended far beyond being chronologically first. She became the theological foundation for understanding what Jesus' resurrection meant for everyone who believed. In the weeks following Easter, as the disciples processed the implications of Jesus' victory over death, Mary's unique background provided crucial insights into the resurrection's significance. Her experience with demonic possession had given her intimate knowledge of spiritual warfare, supernatural power, and the reality of forces beyond the physical world. "Don't you see?" she explained to the gathered disciples one evening. Jesus' resurrection proves that the same power that freed me from 7 demons can free anyone from any form of bondage. Death itself was the ultimate demon, the final enemy that held humanity captive. When Jesus conquered death, he demonstrated that no spiritual force can ultimately prevail against God's love. This theological framework, understanding resurrection as the ultimate deliverance, became central to apostolic preaching throughout the first century. Paul's letters repeatedly reference Jesus' victory over spiritual powers, his triumph over demonic authorities, his liberation of captives from Satan's kingdom. Mary's evangelistic ministry expanded rapidly as word spread about her resurrection encounter. Women throughout Palestine sought her out, wanting to hear firsthand about seeing the risen Christ. Her testimony carried unique authority because she could honestly claim direct personal conversation with Jesus after his resurrection. In Antioch, she established the first known women's ministry focused specifically on resurrection hope. Former prostitutes, abandoned wives, and victims of domestic violence found in Mary's story proof that no one was beyond redemption, no life too broken for God to restore. "I was possessed by 7 demons," she would tell these gatherings. "I lost my family's respect, my community's acceptance, my own identity. But the same Jesus who rose from the dead first gave me back my life. If he could transform someone like me, he can certainly transform you." Her ministry proved particularly effective among Gentile women who'd never heard Jewish scripture, but understood the universal language of personal transformation. Mary's ability to communicate complex theological truths through simple testimony made her one of early Christianity's most effective cross-cultural evangelists. Historical records suggest that Mary traveled extensively throughout the Roman Empire, establishing churches and training female leaders in cities from Damascus to Rome. Unlike the male apostles, who often focused on synagogue preaching and theological debates, Mary specialized in personal ministry to individuals whose lives mirrored her own pre-conversion brokenness. In Ephesus, she mentored Priscilla, who would later become one of the most influential women in the early church. In Corinth, she established support networks for women struggling with mental illness, addiction, and social rejection. In Rome, she reportedly ministered to women in Caesar's household, introducing the resurrection message to the highest levels of imperial society. Mary's theological contributions extended beyond evangelism to doctrinal development. Her understanding of spiritual warfare, gained through personal experience with demonic oppression, helped shape early Christian teaching about believers' authority over evil spirits. "Jesus didn't just cast demons out of me," she taught. "He gave me authority over the forces that once controlled my life." Every believer has access to that same power through faith in his resurrection. This teaching became foundational to Christian deliverance ministry throughout church history. Mary's combination of personal experience and theological insight established principles for spiritual warfare that remain influential today. But perhaps Mary's most significant contribution was demonstrating that God's calling isn't limited by gender, social status, or past failures. Her appointment as the first resurrection witness challenged cultural assumptions about women's roles in religious leadership. The same God who chose me, a former demoniac, a woman with no formal religious training, to be the first evangelist of the resurrection, can use anyone willing to share their testimony, she taught. Your greatest weakness can become your most powerful ministry tool when placed in God's hands. By the time Mary reached old age, churches throughout the Roman Empire knew her story. The woman who'd once been controlled by 7 demons had become one of Christianity's most respected leaders, proving that resurrection power could transform any life completely. Her legacy lived on in countless women who'd found hope through her ministry, in churches established through her evangelism, and in theological frameworks developed through her insights. Mary Magdalene had evolved from demon-possessed outcast to apostle to the apostles, from society's reject to the church's foundation, from spiritual captive to liberator of others trapped in similar darkness. 60 years after her resurrection encounter, Mary Magdalene sits in a simple stone house overlooking the Mediterranean, dictating her life story to Luke, the physician historian who's documenting the early Christian movement. At 82, her voice remains strong, her memory crystalline, her passion for sharing the resurrection message as intense as ever. People ask me if I ever regret those 2 years of demonic possession, she tells Luke, her weathered hands gesturing expressively as she speaks. They see only the suffering, the lost time, the humiliation I endured. But I tell them this, without that darkness, I never would have appreciated the light. Without that bondage, I couldn't have understood true freedom. Without that brokenness, I wouldn't recognize the power that makes people whole. Luke carefully records her words on papyrus, understanding that he's preserving testimony from the most important eyewitness in Christian history. This elderly woman sitting before him had spoken face to face with the risen Christ, had been personally commissioned to proclaim the resurrection, had established churches throughout the Roman Empire. But Mary's legacy extends far beyond her personal achievements. Her story has become the template for understanding God's power to transform any life, no matter how damaged or hopeless it might appear. In Jerusalem, the church led by James, the brother of Jesus, regularly shares Mary's testimony when ministering to people struggling with mental illness, addiction, or demonic oppression. Her story provides hope for families watching loved ones destroyed by forces beyond human control. If Mary Magdalene could be completely healed after 7 demons controlled her life for 2 years, then no condition is beyond God's ability to restore, teaches James to congregations that include many former outcasts and social rejects. Throughout Asia Minor, churches established by Paul reference Mary's transformation when explaining the gospel to pagans familiar with demon worship and spiritual bondage. Her story translates across cultural boundaries because the reality of spiritual oppression and the possibility of divine deliverance are universally understood human experiences. In Alexandria, Christian scholars study Mary's theological insights about spiritual warfare and resurrection power. Her writings, preserved by churches she established, reveal sophisticated understanding of supernatural realities that could only come from someone who'd experienced both demonic control and divine liberation. But Mary's influence reaches beyond religious circles into broader society's understanding of mental illness, women's leadership potential, and the possibility of complete personal transformation. Roman physicians, intrigued by Mary's dramatic recovery from what they diagnosed as incurable insanity, have begun questioning purely medical approaches to mental disorders. Some now acknowledge that certain conditions might have spiritual dimensions requiring non-traditional interventions. The case of Mary of Magdala challenges our assumptions about the mind's relationship to the soul, writes Dr. Marcus Aurelius in a medical treatise circulated throughout the empire. Her instantaneous recovery after years of progressive deterioration suggests healing mechanisms beyond current scientific understanding. Women throughout the Roman world have found in Mary's story permission to pursue leadership roles previously reserved for men. If God could choose a former demoniac to be the first resurrection witness, then gender and past failures need not disqualify anyone from significant ministry. In Gaul, a former temple prostitute named Claudia has established a network of safe houses for women escaping trafficking, directly inspired by Mary's ministry to social outcasts. Mary Magdalene shows us that our worst experiences can become our greatest qualifications for helping others. Claudia explains to supporters. In Britain, recently converted Celtic women cite Mary's example when establishing healing ministries that combine Christian prayer with traditional herbal remedies. She understood both demonic oppression and divine deliverance, they explain. We seek the same spiritual authority over darkness that she demonstrated. The theological implications of Mary's story continue expanding as the Church develops doctrine. Her experience proves that salvation isn't limited by the severity of spiritual bondage, the duration of demonic control, or the social status of the afflicted person. Mary's deliverance establishes the principle that no one is beyond redemption, writes the Apostle Paul in a letter to Timothy. If 7 demons couldn't prevent her salvation, then no amount of sin or spiritual darkness can disqualify anyone from God's grace. Her role as the first resurrection witness has sparked ongoing discussions about women's authority to teach and lead in religious contexts. Progressive church leaders point to Mary's apostolic commission as evidence that God's calling transcends gender boundaries. Christ himself chose Mary to proclaim the resurrection to the male apostles, argues Priscilla in letters to churches throughout Asia Minor. If women were qualified to be the first evangelists, how can they be disqualified from continued ministry leadership? Conservative leaders acknowledge Mary's unique historical role while maintaining distinctions between her extraordinary calling and normal church practices. But even they cannot deny that God used a woman to launch the most important message in human history. As Christianity spreads throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, Mary's story travels with it, providing hope for millions of people trapped in various forms of bondage. Her transformation from demon-possessed outcast to resurrection witness becomes proof that God specializes in impossible situations. In distant India, Christian missionaries share Mary's story with Hindu converts familiar with concepts of spiritual possession and divine intervention. Her testimony resonates with audiences who understand supernatural realities but need evidence that the Christian God possesses superior power over demonic forces. In North Africa, church leaders use Mary's example when training exorcists and deliverance ministers. Her experience provides practical insights into the nature of demonic oppression and the process of spiritual liberation. But perhaps Mary's most significant modern impact lies in her demonstration that past failures don't disqualify anyone from future usefulness in God's kingdom. Her story challenges society's tendency to define people by their worst moments rather than their ultimate potential. I was known throughout Galilee as Mary the demon-possessed. She reflects to Luke as their interview nears its end. Children ran when they saw me. Adults crossed streets to avoid me. Religious leaders declared me cursed by God. But Jesus saw past my condition to my destiny. He knew that the same woman controlled by 7 demons could become a leader of thousands, a witness to the resurrection, a mother in the faith to countless others. As evening settles over the Mediterranean, Mary concludes with words that will echo through centuries of Christian history. Remember this above all: your greatest weakness can become your most powerful ministry when surrendered to God. The very experiences that seem to disqualify you may be precisely what qualifies you for extraordinary purpose. I am living proof that no one is beyond redemption. No life too broken for divine restoration. No darkness too deep for resurrection, light to penetrate. Luke sets down his stylus, understanding that he's recorded testimony from one of history's most remarkable women. Mary Magdalene's transformation from demon-possessed outcast to apostle to the apostles will inspire generations of believers who need evidence that God can transform any life completely. Her legacy lives on in every person who finds hope in their darkest moment, strength in their deepest weakness, and purpose in their most painful experiences.